Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're starting a new book, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, and I will start with the introduction. For all who like adventure, this book will prove an open gateway, though through it they may pass to strange adventures on the high seas and on tropic shores. With the young runaway hero, they may escape from humdrum, everyday existence into a thrilling life of excitement and danger, slavery and shipwreck. With him, they may come to the desert island where, alone for 24 years, he manages, by hard work and ingenuity, to supply food, clothing, and shelter for himself. They may share his terror at the coming of the cannibals and his joy when at last he has a companion. They may be present during the final swift-moving days, packed with peril and excitement that end in his escape. Let no one think that this is drawn wholly from the author's imagination. It is founded upon the experiences of Alexander Selkirk, a Scotch lad who was on a ship wrecked off the coast of Chile. The young man was tossed by the sea upon the island of Juan Fernandez, which was uninhabited at that time. He saved the supplies from the ship and lived for some years alone on the island. How much Defoe added to Selkirk's adventures cannot now be told, but there is no doubt that he interwove facts and fancies until he produced a story unparalleled for its absorbing interest. Many a book of adventure has been written since this one. Many a story has been centered around shipwreck and life on a desert island. It is interesting to note, however, that Robinson Crusoe is the beginning of all fictional adventure. Thousands of authors have followed where Defoe led, but his book still holds the place it won 200 years ago. It has been translated into many languages and dialects. It has charmed the story-loving Arabs. It is familiar to the children in our island possessions, and it is available even in Esperanto. One element of value in this book has often been overlooked. With the greatly increased emphasis on the social studies has come a problem of making our pupils understand the tremendous significance in their daily lives of the interdependence of occupations, social groups, geographical regions, and perhaps most important of all, of the nations of the earth. Robinson Crusoe shows in striking contrast a purely independent individual life, wresting a rudimentary and laborious existence from a somewhat kindly natural environment. The alert teacher of the social studies will frequently use this background as an illuminating contrast with the conditions and problems she wishes to present. A word as to the text may not be out of place. Some long and involved sentences have been separated into two or more statements to suit modern readers. However, care has been taken to preserve the exact thought in every case. A few paragraphs have been eliminated, but every incident in the life of Robinson Crusoe from the time he first left home until the time he was again settled in England is here set forth in the words and the style used by Daniel Defoe in 1719. Only such notes have been given as seemed necessary, but for the most part, the unusual words and expressions can be understood from their use in the text. In the author's version, there are no chapters, but in this edition, it has seemed desirable to divide the text into chapters, though the division does not affect the story itself. Here, then, is the life and adventures of Robinson Crusoe, a book that started a new era in stories. May all the boys and girls who read it now enjoy the tale as did the old and young who read it 200 years ago. And I have to say this book was published in 1925. The Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, Chapter 1, The First Voyage. I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York of a good family, though not of that country. My father was a foreigner of Bremen who settled first at Hull. He got a good estate by merchandise and, leaving off his trade, lived afterwards at York. There he married my mother, whose relations were named Robinson, a very good family in that country. For them, I was called Robinson. Our English neighbors corrupted my father's name into Crusoe, and therefore my playmates called me Robinson Crusoe. Being the third son of the family and not bred to any trade, my head began to be filled very early with rambling thoughts. My father, who was very ancient, had given me a competent share of learning as far as house education and a country free school generally goes, and designed me for the law. but I would be satisfied with nothing but going to sea. My inclination to this led me so strongly against the will, nay, the commands of my father, and against all the entreaties and persuasions of my mother and other friends, that there seemed to be something fatal in that inclination leading directly to the life of misery which was to befall me. My father, a wise and grave man, gave me serious and excellent counsel against what he foresaw was my design. He called me one morning into his chamber, where he was confined by the gout, and expostulated very warmly with me upon this subject. He asked me what reasons, more than a mere wandering inclination, I had for leaving my father's house and my native country, where I might be well introduced and had a prospect of raising my fortune by application and industry with a life of ease and pleasure. He told me it was for men of desperate fortunes on one hand, or of aspiring superior fortunes on the other, who went abroad upon adventures to rise by enterprise and make themselves famous in undertakings of a nature out of the common road. These things were all either too far above me or too far below me. Mine was the middle state. He had found by long experience that this was the best state in the world, the most suited to human happiness, not exposed to the miseries and hardships, and not embarrassed with the pride, luxury, ambition, and envy of the upper part of mankind. Excuse me. He told me that I might judge of the happiness of this state by this one thing, namely, that this was the state of life which all other people envied, that kings have frequently lamented the miserable consequences of being born to great things, and have wished that they had been placed in the middle of the two extremes, between the mean and the great, that the wise man gave his testimony to this, as the just standard of true felicity, when he prayed to have neither poverty nor riches. He bade me observe it, and I should always find that the calamities of life were shared among the upper and lower part of mankind, but that the middle station had the fewest disasters and was not exposed to so many vicissitudes as the higher or lower part of mankind. After this, he pressed me earnestly, and in the most affectionate manner, not to play the young man, not to precipitate myself into miseries which nature and the station of life I was born in seemed to have provided against. He reminded me that I was under no necessity of seeking my bread, that he would do well for me and endeavor to enter me fairly into the station of life which he had just been recommending to me. He pointed out to me that if I was not very easy and happy in the world, it must be my mere fate or fault that must hinder it, and that he should have nothing to answer for, having thus discharged his duty in warning me against measures which he knew would be to my hurt. In a word, that as he would do very kind things for me if I would stay and settle at home as he directed, so he would not have so much hand in my misfortunes as to give me any encouragement to go away. My father went on to say that he would not cease to pray for me, yet he would venture to say to me that if I did take this foolish step, God would not bless me, and I would have leisure hereafter to reflect upon having neglected his counsel when there might be none to assist in my recovery. I was sincerely affected with this discourse, as indeed who could be otherwise, and I resolved not to think of going abroad any more, but to settle at home, according to my father's desire. But alas, a few days wore it all off, and in short, to prevent any of my father's further importunities, a few weeks afterwards, I resolved to run quite away from him. However, I did not act so hastily as my first heat of resolution prompted, but I took my mother at a time when I thought her a little pleasanter than ordinary, and told her that my thoughts were so entirely bent upon seeing the world that I should never settle to anything with resolution enough to go through with it, and my father had better give me his consent than force me to go without it. I told her that I was now 18 years old, which was too late to go apprentice to a trade or clerk to an attorney. Moreover, I was sure that if I did, I should never serve out my time, and I should certainly run away from my master before my time was out and go to sea. I assured her that if she would speak to my father to let me go but one voyage abroad, if I came home again and did not like it, I would go no more, and I would promise by a double diligence to recover that time I had lost. This put my mother into a great passion. She told me that she knew it would be to no purpose to speak to my father upon any such subject. He knew too well what was my interest to give his consent to anything so much for my hurt. She wondered how I could think of any such thing after such a discourse as I had had from my father, and such kind and tender expressions as she knew my father had used to me. She said that, in short, if I would ruin myself, There was no help for me, but I might depend I should never have their consent to it. For her part, she would not have so much hand in my destruction, and I should never have it to say that my mother was willing when my father was not. Though my mother refused to ask my father's permission, yet as I heard afterwards, she reported all the discourse to him. My father, after showing a great concern at it, said to her with a sigh, "That boy might be happy if he would stay at home, but if he goes abroad, he will be the most miserable wretch that ever was born. I can give no consent to it." It was not till almost a year after this that I broke loose, though in the meantime I continued obstinately deaf to all proposals of settling to business, and frequently expostulated with my father and mother about their being so positively determined against what they knew my inclinations prompted me to. But one day, when I was at Hull, where I went casually, and without any purpose of running away that time, one of my companions, who was about to sail to London in his father's ship, prompted me to go with them, with the common allurement of seafaring men, that it should cost me nothing for my passage. I consulted neither father nor mother any more, nor so much as sent them word of it, leaving them to hear of it as they might, without asking God's blessing or my father's, without any consideration of circumstances or consequences, and in an ill hour, God knows, on the 1st of September, 1651, I went on board a ship bound for London. Never any young adventurer's misfortunes, I believe, began sooner or continued longer than mine. The ship was no sooner gotten out of the Humber, but the wind began to blow and the waves to rise in a most frightful manner. As I had never been at sea before, I was most inexpressibly sick in body and terrified in mind. I began now seriously to reflect upon what I had done and how justly I was overtaken by the judgment of heaven for my wickedly leaving my father's house and abandoning my duty. All the good counsel of my parents, my father's tears, and my mother's entreaties, came now fresh into my mind, and my conscience, which was not yet come to the pitch of hardness to which it has been since, reproached me with the contempt of advice, and the breach of my duty to God and my father. All this while the storm increased, and the sea, which I had never been upon before, went very high, though nothing like what I have seen many times since, nor like what I saw a few days after. But it was enough to affect me then, who was but a young sailor, and had never known anything of the matter. I expected that every wave would have swallowed us up, and that every time the ship fell down, as I thought, in the trough or hollow of the sea, we should never rise more. In this agony of mind, I made many vows and resolutions that if it would please God here to spare my life this one voyage, if ever I got my foot upon dry land again, I would go directly home to my father and never set it into a ship again while I lived, that I would take his advice and never run myself into such miseries as these any more. Now I saw plainly the goodness of his observations about the middle station of life, how easy, how comfortably he had lived all his days, and never had been exposed to tempests at sea or troubles on shore. I resolved that I would, like a true repenting prodigal, go home to my father. These wise and sober thoughts continued all the while the storm continued, and indeed some time after. But the next day the wind was abated, and the sea calmer, and I began to be a little used to it. However, I was very grave for all that day, being also a little seasick still, but toward night the weather cleared up, the wind was quite over, and a charming fine evening followed. The sun went down perfectly clear, and rose so the next morning. There was little or no wind, and a smooth sea with the sun shining upon it, and the sight was, as I thought, the most delightful that ever I saw. I had slept well in the night, and was now no more seasick, but very cheerful, looking with wonder upon the sea that was so rough and terrible the day before, and could be so calm and so pleasant in so little time after. And now, lest my good resolutions should continue, my companion, who had indeed enticed me away, comes to me. "Well, Bob," says he, clapping me upon the shoulder, "how do you do after it? I warrant you were frightened, wasn't you last night, when it blew but a capful of wind?" "A capful, do you call it?" said I. "It was a terrible storm." "A terrible storm, you silly creature," replied he, half laughing. "Do you call that a storm? Why, it was nothing at all. Give us but a good ship and sea room, and we think nothing of such a squall of wind as that. But you are but a fresh water sailor, Bob. Come, let us make a bowl of punch, and we'll forget all that. Do you see what charming weather it is now?" To make short this sad part of my story, we went the old way of all sailors. The punch was made, and I was made drunk with it. And in that one night's wickedness I drowned all my repentance, all my reflections upon my past conduct, and all my resolutions for my future. In a word, as the sea was returned to its smoothness of surface and settled calmness by the abatement of that storm, so the hurry of my thoughts being over, my fears and apprehensions of being swallowed up by the sea being forgotten, and the current of my former desires returned, I entirely forgot the vows and promises that I made in my distress. I found, indeed, some intervals of reflection, and the serious thoughts did, as it were, endeavor to return again sometimes. But I shook them off and roused myself from them as if it were from a distemper, and applying myself to drink and company, soon mastered the return of those fits, for so I called them. Thus, in 5 or 6 days, I had got as complete a victory over conscience as any young fellow that resolved not to be troubled with it could desire. But I was to have another trial for it still, and Providence, as in such cases generally it does, resolved to leave me entirely without excuse. For if I would not take this for a deliverance, the next was to be such a one that the worst and most hardened wretch among us would confess both the danger and the mercy. The 6th day of our being at sea, we came into Yarmouth roads. The wind having been contrary and the weather calm, we had made but little way since the storm. Here we were obliged to come to an anchor, and here we lay, the wind continuing contrary, namely at southwest, for 7 or 8 days, during which times a great many ships from Newcastle came into the same roads as the common harbor, where the ships might wait for a wind from the river. We should not have ridden here so long, however, but should have gone up the river on the tide, but that the wind blew too fresh, and after we had lain 4 or 5 days, blew very hard. However, the roads being reckoned as good as a harbor, the anchorage good, and our ground tackle very strong, our men were unconcerned, and not in the least apprehensive of danger, but spent the time in rest and mirth after the manner of the sea. The 8th day in the morning the wind increased, and we had all hands at work to strike our topmasts and make everything snug and close, that the ship might ride as easy as possible. By noon, the sea went very high indeed, and our ship rode forecastle in, shipped several seas, and we thought once or twice our anchor had come home, upon which our master ordered out the sheet anchor, so that we rode with 2 anchors ahead, and the cables veered out to the end. By this time, it blew a terrible storm indeed, and now I began to see terror and amazement in the faces even of the seamen themselves. The master, though vigilant in the business of preserving the ship, yet as he went in and out of his cabin by me, I could hear him say softly to himself several times, "Lord, be merciful to us. We shall be all lost. We shall be all undone," and the like. During these first hurries, I was stupid, lying still in my cabin, which was in the steerage, and cannot describe my temper. I could ill reassume the first penitence which I had so apparently trampled upon and hardened myself against. I thought the bitterness of death had been past, and that this would be nothing like the first. But when the master himself came by me, as I said just now, and said we should be all lost, I was dreadfully frightened. I got up out of my cabin and looked out, but such a dismal sight I never saw. The sea went mountains high and broke upon us every 3 or 4 minutes. When I could look about, I could see nothing but distress round us. 2 ships that rode near us, we found, had cut their masts by the board, being deep laden, and our men cried out that a ship which rode about a mile ahead of us was foundered. 2 more ships, being driven from their anchors, were run out of the roads to sea, and that was not a mast standing. The light ships fared the best, because they did not labor so much in the sea, but 2 or 3 of them drove and came close by us, running away with only their spritsail out before the wind. Toward evening, the mate and the boatswain begged the master of our ship to let them cut away the foremast, which he was very unwilling to do. But the boatswain protesting to him that if he did not, the ship would founder, he consented. When they had cut away the foremast, the mainmast stood so loose and shook the ship so much that they were obliged to cut her away also and make a clear deck. Anyone may judge what a condition I was in at all this, who was but a young sailor and who had been in such a fright before at but a little. But if I can express at this distance the thoughts I had about me at that time, I was in tenfold more horror of mind on account of my former convictions, and because I had turned from them to the resolutions I had wickedly taken at first, than I was at death itself. These, added to the terror of the storm, put me into such a condition that I can by no words describe it. We had a good ship, but she was deep laden and wallowed in the sea, so that the seamen every now and then cried out that she would founder. It was my advantage in one respect that I did not know what they meant by founder till I inquired. However, the storm was so violent that I saw what is not often seen: the master, the boatswain, and some others more sensible than the rest at their prayers and expecting every moment that the ship would go to the bottom. In the middle of the night, on top of all the rest of our distresses, one of the men that had been down on purpose to see cried out that we had sprung a leak. Another said there were 4 feet of water in the hold. Then all hands were called to the pump. At that very word, my heart, as I thought, died within me, and I fell backwards from the side of my bed where I sat into the cabin. However, the men roused me and told me that I, who was able to do nothing before, was as well able to pump as another. At this, I stirred up and went to the pump and worked very heartily. While this was doing, the master saw some light colliers, who, not able to ride out the storm, were obliged to slip and run away to sea. They would not come near us, and the master ordered a gun to be fired as a signal of distress. I, who knew nothing what that meant, was so surprised that I thought the ship had broken or some dreadful thing happened. In a word, I was so surprised that I fell down in a swoon. As this was a time when everybody had his own life to think of, nobody minded me or what was become of me, but another man stepped up to the pump and, thrusting me aside with his foot, let me lie, thinking I had been dead. It was a great while before I came to myself. We worked on, but the water increasing in the hold, it was apparent that the ship would founder. Though the storm began to abate a little, yet it was not possible she could swim till we might run into a port, so the master continued firing guns for help, and a light ship who had ridden it out just ahead of us ventured a boat out to help us. It was with the utmost hazard that the boat came near us, but it was impossible for us to get on board, or for the boat to lie near the ship's side. At last, the men rowing very heartily and venturing their lives to save ours, our men cast them a rope over the stern with a buoy to it, and then veered it out a great length, which they, after great labor and hazard, took hold of, and we hauled them close under our stern and got all into their boat. It was to no purpose for them or us, after we were in the boat, to think of reaching to their own ship, so all agreed to let her drive and only to pull her in towards shore as much as we could, and our master promised them that if the boat was staved upon shore, he would make it good to their master. So partly rowing and partly driving, our boat went away to the northward, sloping toward the shore, almost as far as Winterton Ness. We were not much more than a quarter of an hour out of our ship before we saw her sink, and then I understood for the first time what was meant by a ship foundering in the sea. I must acknowledge that I had hardly eyes to look up when the seamen told me she was sinking, for from that moment they rather put me into the boat than that I might be said to go in. My heart was, as it were, dead within me, partly with fright, partly with horror of mind, and the thoughts of what was yet before me. While we were in this condition, the men yet laboring at the oars to bring the boat near the shore, we could see, when our boat mounting the waves we were able to see the shore, a great many people running along the shore to assist us when we should come near. We made but slow way toward the shore, nor were we able to reach it, till being past the lighthouse at Winterton, the shore falls off to the westward toward Cromer, and so the land broke off a little the violence of the wind. Here we got in, and though not without much difficulty, got all safe on shore, and walked afterwards on foot to Yarmouth, where, as unfortunate men, we were used with great humanity, as well by the magistrates of the town, who assigned us good quarters, as by particular merchants and owners of ships, and had money given us sufficient to carry us either to London or back to Hull, as we thought fit. But my ill fate pushed me on now with an obstinacy that nothing could resist, and though I had several times loud calls from my reason and my more composed judgment to go home, yet I had no power to do it. I know not what to call this, nor will I urge that it is a secret overruling decree that hurries us on to be the instruments of our own destruction, even though it be before us, and that we rush upon it with our eyes open. Certainly nothing but some such decreed misery attending, and which it was impossible for me to escape, could have pushed me forward against the calm reasonings and persuasions of my most retired thoughts, and against 2 such visible instructions as I had met with in my first attempt. My comrade, who had helped to harden me before, and who was the master's son, was now less forward than I. The first time he spoke to me after we were at Yarmouth, which was not till 2 or 3 days, for we were separated in the town to several quarters, I say the first time he saw me, it appeared his tone was altered. He looked very melancholy, and shaking his head, asked me how I did. He told his father who I was, and how I had come this voyage only for a trial in order to go farther abroad. His father turned to me with a grave and concerned tone. "Young man," said he, "you ought never to go to sea any more. You ought to take this for a plain and visible token that you are not to be a seafaring man." "Why, sir," said I, "will you go to sea no more?" "That is another case," said he. "It is my calling and therefore my duty, but as you made this voyage for a trial, you see what a taste heaven has given you of what you are to expect if you persist. Perhaps this has all befallen us on your account, like Jonah in the ship of Tarshish. Pray," continued he, "what are you, and on what account did you go to sea?" I told him some of my story, at the end of which he burst out with a strange kind of passion. "What had I done," says he, "that such an unhappy wretch should come into my ship? I would not set my foot in the same ship with thee again for 1,000 pounds. However, he afterwards talked very gravely to me, and exhorted me to go back to my father, and not tempt Providence to my ruin. He told me I might see a visible hand of heaven against me. And, young man," said he, "depend upon it, if you do not go back, wherever you go, you will meet with nothing but disasters and disappointments, till your father's words are fulfilled upon you." We parted soon after, for I made him little answer, and I saw him no more. Which way he went, I know not. As for me, having some money in my pocket, I traveled to London by land, and there, as well as on the road, had many struggles with myself what course of life I should take, and whether I should go home or go to sea. As to going home, shame opposed the best motions that offered to my thoughts, and it immediately occurred to me how I should be laughed at among the neighbors, and should be ashamed to see, not my father and mother only, but even everybody else. I have since often observed how incongruous and irrational the common temper of mankind is, especially of youth, to that reason which ought to guide them in such cases, namely, that they are not ashamed to sin, and yet are ashamed to repent, not ashamed of the action for which they ought justly to be esteemed fools, but are ashamed of the returning which only can make them esteemed wise men. We will stop there for today and start next time with chapter 2. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.